They're very excited that he's here. Very excited. Yeah, I know. He came all the way from Cary, Apex, wherever he lives now. I mean, I know. We got an all-star thing going. Boy, it got quite. Woo. Ice. That doesn't happen in class. Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the third annual SSRP Symposium. This program and its supporters have grown over the last 3 years, and I want to acknowledge everyone who's helped with that growth. Faculty, staff, coaches, mentors, parents, just to name a few of the many kinds of influences that guide our students. This program has produced in its graduates character and conviction. I'm looking at two of them right over there. Born of commitment, devotion, and unwavering faith in the invaluable quality of intellectual curiosity. I continue to be humbled and amazed by what our students can do, and this year's symposium promises to be awe-inspiring. With one exception, I have taught all of these students since 9th grade, and to see their talents showcased in tonight's event makes me profoundly grateful to be part of something that will have far-reaching effects, because I know that they will do great things. To accommodate the size of this year's cohort, we've split the event into 2 evenings. So we'll have our first ever keynote tonight. I mean, now you know we're the real deal. We have a keynote. And the keynote talk will be followed by a brief Q&A, and then a short refreshment break. So if you didn't get a chance to grab something to eat or grab a glass of water, don't worry, there will be time soon. And then after that, our 2 student presenters tonight will give their presentations. I will introduce each of them in turn, and we'll have a Q&A following the second presenter. So take notes mentally or literally and prepare for a dynamic discussion for our Q&A sessions. Our first speaker tonight is Dr. Jennifer Nolan. Dr. Nolan is an associate professor of English at North Carolina State University, where she teaches courses on 20th century American literature and society. She is a periodical studies scholar whose work has appeared in journals such as Book History, Journal of Modern Periodical Studies, F. Scott Fitzgerald Review, and American Periodicals. And she is co-editor of the complete magazine stories of F. Scott Fitzgerald, 1921 to 1924. She's a proud member of the board of the F. Scott Fitzgerald Society and very much looking forward to all of the centennial celebrations of The Great Gatsby in 2025. My AP Lang class is having a Gatsby party next week if you want to get the party started early. I've had the pleasure of meeting Professor Nolan at American literature conferences and seeing her present before. I'm very much looking forward to her talk titled F. Scott Fitzgerald and Jazz Age Mass Media. Dr. Nolan.
Just a sec for me to get this set up. All right, well, thank you very much for having me tonight. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you especially to each of the signature scholars. Congratulations on all of your research and on your graduations, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from Caroline and Audrey tonight. I'm sorry that I can't be here to hear from the rest of you tomorrow. Ballet calls, not mine, my daughter's. But I'm very honored to have been invited to talk, and I'm excited to hear more about and from each of you. As a print culture scholar, I work with material objects from the past, specifically those from 20th century America, and much of my research involves delving into archival materials, the magazines themselves, of which I have brought one to show you, and I'll be returning to this a little bit, but then also things like letters, the sketches that accompanied the stories that were put in these places, and all other types of paraphernalia. Today, I'm going to be focusing on examples from two different examples from my work on F. Scott Fitzgerald's magazine fiction to help demonstrate what we can learn from this type of research. Why Fitzgerald, you ask? Well, Fitzgerald is best known as the author of The Great Gatsby, which, of course, is celebrating its centennial, as noted, in 2025. But he primarily supported himself through his publication of short stories in these types of popular magazines. And he found his large audiences there by far, as I will explain. Okay, so first, a little terminology. We have the Jazz Age, or as some think of it, the Roaring Twenties, to thank for the terms mass market and mass media in 1922 and 1923, respectively. And of course, F. Scott Fitzgerald himself to thank for coming up with the term the Jazz Age to describe the massive social, cultural, and artistic shifts that characterized the 1920s. It is no exaggeration to say that during the Jazz Age, the popular magazine market held the power and influence to change a writer or artist's life virtually overnight, as happened to F. Scott Fitzgerald, which not only led, in his case, to personal celebrity and book sales, but also attention from the nascent film industry. So 3 of his early short stories were made into silent films within a year of their publication. Tellingly, the word mass media was not created to describe that early film industry, however, as we might think, but rather to describe advertising for popular magazines. In 1920, when Fitzgerald first began publishing in the Saturday Evening Post, which was the most popular magazine of its era, it had a weekly circulation of over 2 million and had reached an estimated 10 million weekly readers by the end of the 1920s. By that point, Fitzgerald was publishing almost exclusively in that magazine. Just to give you a little bit of contrast here, sales of The Great Gatsby in 1925, which is the year, of course, it was published, didn't even reach 25,000. So we're comparing 25,000 to 10 million. So to understand the role of the magazines in Fitzgerald's career and for artists of his era, and I do mean the term artist broadly here because it's not just writers, but it is also visual artists. We're going to see some of their work in just a minute. We must begin with an understanding of what this Jazz Age magazine market was like itself. And this world is really not as far removed as it may first seem, because in some ways the rise of streaming services, with the rise of streaming services, we've returned to a mass communication style that's more reminiscent of the Jazz Age than the network era that came in between. So what do I mean by that? Well, much like our streaming services today, families would subscribe to magazines like the Saturday Evening Post, which were full of different types of materials. So of course we have fiction. These are 2 of Fitzgerald's early stories and their illustrations, which I will come back to. Also in the same issue, there would be political editorials and nonfiction articles, example there. And of course, the advertisements that paid for all of it. And each of these different types of features appealed to different members of the household who shared their magazines, much like we do our Netflix passwords don't tell Netflix. So, for example, somebody might get it because they want to read the mystery that's being published serially each, in several different issues. Somebody else might really like Fitzgerald's fiction and be getting it because they want to be reading the Flapper stories that he's publishing in the early 1920s. Somebody else might really want to be reading the political editorials. And everybody is approaching it for their own reasons, reading the parts that they want, not looking at the other parts, just like we do with Netflix, right? Like not everybody watches the same thing or any of those streaming services. And just as we now have a plethora of viewing options and streaming services to appeal to different audiences, Jazz Age readers not only had their pick of content, but also an array of magazines from which to find their entertainment. This slide includes every magazine that Fitzgerald published in during the Jazz Age. Not each copy, but each magazine. Or to center him as scaled to indicate the influence of each in Fitzgerald's career during this period. So the magazines on the right there are the ones where he published 1 or 2 times, and the Saturday Evening Post on the left there, he had 33 stories that appeared there by the end of 1929. At which time he was paid the remarkable sum of $4,000 a story. Ask any creative writer now, and they would be thrilled to get $4,000 in today's terms for a story. If we want to put that $4,000 in today's money, that's a little more like $73,000. So just to give you a sense of how many people were reading this and also how well he and others were being paid to put their work here. So unlike today, where we encounter Fitzgerald short stories in a book of other stories, perhaps, or an anthology of American literature, if you're reading it for a class, that is surrounded by primarily other stories, right? Most of Fitzgerald's readers found his stories surrounded by other materials that both directly and indirectly shaped the way that they were understood. Stories published in magazines in this era, as I've said before, were accompanied by illustrations that were created to interpret and represent different scenes in the story. And though these pictures are omitted in modern reprintings of these stories, for readers of these magazines in the 1920s, these images were as much a part of their experience of reading the story as images are in a comic book today. So a little bit about illustration. The first part of this will focus on what's happening there. In 1923, the editors of the Saturday Evening Post put together a booklet outlining the philosophies and editorial policies of the magazine. Among the topics that were covered was a chapter on illustration's part in selling the Post, which begins with the assertion that, quote, an illustration in its most practical function is an advanced salesman of the text. So the editors imagined a reader, quote, standing at the counter of the editor's wares, whose choice of what to engage with is guided almost exclusively by the eye and not as yet the mind. The artists who served as these advanced salesmen included, quote, noted leaders of magazine illustration whose names were familiar to most Post readers. And they were very well compensated for their efforts, just as well compensated as Fitzgerald was. And as famous, well-known, and well-regarded as the writers whose work they brought visually to life. In fact, in many cases, as was certainly the case when Fitzgerald started first publishing his stories in the Post, the illustrators were often much more famous, much better known, and much more well-regarded than the authors themselves, and thus just as likely, or again, even more likely, to attract readers into the story than the author. So it is a fundamentally different way of understanding literature and authorship than what we think of now. So among these artists who were familiar to Post readers is Arthur William Brown. He illustrated Fitzgerald's third appearance in the Post, The Camel's Back, along with The Jelly Bean, which appeared in another magazine, Metropolitan, later that year. He had been a prolific illustrator throughout Fitzgerald's childhood and young adulthood, and his work made such an impression on Fitzgerald that in a 1922 letter to Brown, Fitzgerald recalled in great detail how much he had enjoyed Brown's illustrations for a 1916 novel, so a novel that he had seen 6 years before. And Fitzgerald was delighted to have had Brown illustrate these stories. As you can see by that quote at the bottom there, "I like all of your work very much and was tremendously pleased at your illustrations for the camel's back and for the jelly bean." As Brown's unpublished memoir relates, Fitzgerald, on the other hand, was still unknown to Brown when he received his commission. One day in 1920, the Post sent me the galley proofs of a story to be illustrated called The Camel's Back. So the galley proofs are the kind of, it's where they've prepared the manuscript for publication. It's not yet ready, and they would send to the illustrator so that the illustrator could read it and figure out what to illustrate. Sorry, back to Brown. It was by F. Scott Fitzgerald, a name I had never heard before. I was so impressed with it that I read it aloud one evening to my guest. In their foundational 2006 essay, The Rise of Periodical Studies, Sean Latham and Robert Scholes point out that, quote, "periodicals are by their nature collaborative objects." And perhaps nowhere is this more true than in the interaction between fiction and the illustrations that interpreted them in illustrated magazines. So here you see the first 2 pages of The Camel's Back in the April 24th, 1920 issue of the Saturday Evening Post, and you can see that they faced each other, right? Which provided readers with 2 advanced salesmen for this story. The first image, zooming in there, presents a very unhappy couple with a caption suggesting that Perry, that's the man, his attempt to Superman the girl sitting next to him into marrying him at once did not go over so well. While the second image presents a party scene with several smiling, outlandishly dressed participants and the camel promised by the title. While both images are intriguing individually, the juxtaposition of the downtrodden scene with the lighthearted one work well together, in the words of the Saturday Evening Post editors, to arrest attention and then, having halted the reader's eye, arouse their curiosity by raising many questions for the story to answer. Among them, who is this sad couple? What happens to them? What is their relationship to the scene depicted in the second image? And, most importantly, why is there a camel at a party? And remember, of course, for this audience, this is all before they start reading, right? This is what they see. In a feature on illustration for the Saturday Evening Post, revealingly titled, "Yes, We Read the Story," another of Fitzgerald's illustrators, Mae Wilson Preston, usefully compared the relationship between an illustrator and a writer to that of a director and a playwright. Quote, "Thinking of herself as a stage director, coaching a cast of actors who must cast and act as well as direct." So here, Brown is drawing in the readers by presenting a conflict, while reassuring them that it will be humorously resolved, thereby signaling that the couple's troubles are not going to bring the reader down too much. And while Fitzgerald had no say in the decision, as we saw before, he was evidently delighted to have had Brown illustrate this story. So what the editors realized was that the meaning of literary works in the Post and magazines like them, because all fiction that was published in these magazines was illustrated at this time, most of it, I should say, all of it in the popular magazines. The meaning of these works was created actually in dialogue with the reader, whose impressions in turn were influenced and guided by the illustrations that accompanied them, and by extension by their illustrators, as we see with Brown here. So in the case of Fitzgerald's early illustrators, the familiarity and popularity of their work with Post audiences welcomed in, framed, and shaped the audience's entry into the up-and-coming young author's creative world, and helped to establish his reputation as the voice of a new generation. Okay, so now we go to part 2, which is about celebrity. By 1923, in contrast to 1920, Fitzgerald was sufficiently well established to be a celebrity in his own right. Both of his first 2 books, This Side of Paradise, which had been published in 1920, and The Beautiful and Damned, which was published in 1922, along with the many stories he continued to publish in popular magazines, made both he and Zelda, his wife, household names, as these magazine and newspaper features demonstrate. So what you have on the left there is an announcement from the May 1923 issue of Hearst International. That is a famous portrait by Alfred Cheney Johnston, which emphasizes Fitzgerald's status as, and I pulled out some of the quotes from the text that they had below it. So they called him the best loved author of the younger generation, and they said his stories are to young people of this generation what O. Henry was to the last. So, and they were promoting him. He had signed a contract, an ill-fated contract, but I won't get into that, to publish a series of stories in Hearst. And the one on the right there is an example of the many newspaper articles featuring Fitzgerald's opinion about all variety of things. So that one, apparently, what he thinks about his wife, who is cited as being the original model for the flapper. And there are just tons and tons of this. I mean, I pulled out one, but there's a whole lot. So that same year, that is 1923, he wrote a story called Rags Martin Jones and the Prince of Wales, in which he considers and makes fun of what it means to be a celebrity in this new area of mass media. Because remember, this is new, that you can be an international celebrity on the scale that he was. So I'm going to take a pause and say, I understand that this story is going to be unfamiliar to you, because it's unfamiliar to most people, but I'm provide enough of a recap to get you through and to be able to see what's happening here. So to start us off, we're going to consider 2 passages, okay? One is fiction by Fitzgerald, and one is a news story. And as you listen, see if you can tell which is which. Okay? All right. So we'll begin first with an arrival. The Majestic came gliding into New York Harbor on an April morning. The very best people in the world stood on the deck and waved idiotically to their poor relations who were waiting on the dock for gloves from Paris. Before long, a great toboggan had connected the Majestic with the North American continent, and the ship began to disgorge these very best people in the world, who turned out to be movie queens, missionaries, retired jewelers, British authors, musical comedy twins, the Duchess Manzini, Nagelberg, and needless to add, Lord and Lady Thingamabob of Thingamabob Manor. At last, from the watchers on the pier, there arose a long drawn ah, as a final entourage began to stream down from deck B. Rags Martin Jones, after 2 years in the capitals of Europe, was returning to her native land. Tap. Her 105 pounds reached the pier, and it seemed to sway and bend from the shock of her beauty. A few porters fainted. A large, sentimental shark, which had followed the ship across, made a despairing leap to see her once more, and then dove, broken-hearted, back into the deep sea. Rags Martin Jones had come home. Okay, and now, a departure. Right. The Renown weighed anchor off 86th Street, Manhattan at 2:30 o'clock. As the huge propellers began to churn the blue waters of the North River into white foam, the Prince passenger began climbing the rope ladder leading to the fighting top. The big fighting ship began to turn her nose toward the sea, and Edward Albert removed his white naval cap and waved it toward Manhattan shore, where thousands crowded Riverside Park from 96th Street to 79th Street. Many more lined Riverside Drive, and hundreds crowded about the base of the Soldiers and Sailors Monument. As the slight figure was seen waving his au revoir to the city, a cheer commenced, swelled, and was lost in the roar of the boom of gun salutes from the United States ships Delaware and Columbia. The last acts of the Prince before quitting New York were typical of the spirit of democracy he had exhibited since his arrival here. The Renown's engines, already tuning up for moving, were ordered stopped. The Prince wished to hear a New York policeman sing. Patrolman Howard Smith was carried to the forward deck and sang, "Dear old pal of mine, and I hear you calling me," while the heir to the throne held the sheets of music. So, as you've probably figured out, the first passage is from the beginning of F. Scott Fitzgerald's story, Rags Martin Jones and the Prince of Wales, which was published in the July 1924 issue of Macaulay's. Incidentally, or perhaps not, the same month that Edward, the actual Prince of Wales, announced his second visit to the United States. And for those of you who watch The Crown, yes, it's that Edward, the one who abdicated the throne, right? Okay. All right. So, in the story, Rags Martin Jones, a world-weary, outrageously rich orphan whose parents had died on the Titanic, has returned to her native New York after 2 years abroad, and she immediately laments returning, claiming no Americans have any imagination. Chased by men due to her wealth and beauty and little else, Rags has all but given up on finding a man who can interest her until John M. Chestnut puts on an elaborate scheme involving the purported Prince of Wales and a murder, and he wins her over. And that's all you need to know about the story for now, but yeah. So the second passage is from a news story. It appeared in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, and it describes the actual prince's departure from New York at the conclusion of his first enormously successful visit to America on November 22nd, 1919, which concluded with a farewell message in which he declared himself a proud New Yorker in his own right and vowed to return. Now keep in mind that at this time, coming to America was a much different proposition than it would be now. He had to come over literally on a ship, and so his trips weren't very frequent, and it was a big deal when he did this, as we will see. So, on the same day of the prince's departure, that is, November 22nd, 1919, an arrival also occurred. Perhaps surrounded by less pomp and circumstance, but nonetheless significant for our purposes. On that day, F. Scott Fitzgerald began a 5-day visit to New York City, and could therefore hardly have avoided all of the press surrounding the prince's departure and visit. That is just one example that I showed you. It's everywhere. When reflecting later on the origin of Rags Martin Jones and the Prince of Wales, he noted the gossip about the Prince of Wales. And the beginning of his story is a pitch-perfect caricature of this type of press, as we've heard, the amount of which only increased in the intervening years. Indeed, at the conclusion of the Prince's 1924 visit, which was his next visit, the press clippings, and I'll explain what those are in just a second, for his 3-week holiday in New York contained 61,120 items in all, weighing 325 pounds, surpassed in volume only by the press clippings generated from Charles Lindbergh's solo flight across the Atlantic in 1927. That is, only Lindbergh was there more written about than the Prince's second visit to the United States. So what press clippings are. At this time, if you were interested in a particular topic, you could ask for these agencies to clip all of the things that were written about whatever that topic was, and they would compile them all for you. So Fitzgerald did this on his own, when he was mentioned in the press in various places, because you can't just look it up online, right? You have to know where people are talking about you. And so this is all of the things written in the US press about this visit from the Prince of Wales to the United States. That is how many things were written about him and just how much space they took up. Okay, so in 1924, McCall's was a well-established women's magazine and was not Fitzgerald's first choice for his story. However, for reasons that I will make clear, it ended up being exactly the right place for this story about the nature of celebrity. Through a confluence of events, including the aforementioned Prince of Wales' decision to return to America in the fall of 1924, McCall's had a cluster of Prince of Wales related items that were published in the 6 months between June of 24 and January of 25. So the first of these, which was largely a fluff piece about the Prince's athleticism, appeared a month before Fitzgerald's story. And it promised to share information about Europe's most attractive man gleaned from a rare talk for publication with an American. So that's the month before the story. So according to McCall's, the success of this interview caused, quote, a great deal of comment everywhere, and therefore prompted a pair of portraits to be published in the September and October issues. Beginning, notably, the same month as the Prince's second visit. And these were written by one of the Prince's inner circle. His name was Major Frank E. Varney, and they purported to provide, quote, the most intimate picture yet given in print. Beginning somewhat combatively, and with impressive alliteration, in the first installment, Varney warns the reader not to expect, quote, the revelations of a peeping Tom acquaintance of the Prince or the paragraphs of a sleuth journalist with a paramount passion for prying into the Prince's privacy. Okay, I did it. And this is a theme that he returns to again and again throughout these pieces. So he just seems very irritated that he's doing this. Telling us in October not to, quote, expect snappy paragraphs describing the Prince's matrimonial intentions or into which color eyes he prefers looking and whose eyes they are. So the link that runs throughout all of these stories is how simultaneously hungry American audiences were for any bit of information about the Prince of Wales. And how little is revealed in any of them. Which is precisely what makes Rags Martin Jones and the Prince of Wales such a brilliant satire. All of these materials serve to reinforce Fitzgerald's point about the nature of celebrity in this new age of mass media. As Ted Powell argues, quote, Edward was one of the superstars of America's first age of media celebrity, which we see exemplified in the image on the left here. That was originally printed in the magazine Vanity Fair, and then it was reprinted in Miguel Covarrubias's facetiously titled 1925 book of caricatures, The Prince of Wales and Other Famous Americans, which tells us, and of course knowing what happened to him later makes that even funnier. But Powell continues talking about the Prince. In America, his personality overshadowed the monarchy of which he was a part. It existed in the realm of celebrity like a movie star's, detached from reality. In Rags Martin Jones, Fitzgerald has created the female equivalent of the actual Prince of Wales. And Powell's description of the prince, which is in the middle there, holds equally true of her. Glamorous and stylish, familiar yet unattainable, she was above all a media celebrity. So, returning to the historical and print context of the mid-1920s gives this story a new significance and demonstrates how it represents Fitzgerald at the height of his powers of social observation, not only reflecting and anticipating the popular trends of his moment, but also incisively examining celebrity in his age at a time in his life when he himself had achieved this status. F. Scott Fitzgerald's writing and cultural significance cannot be fully understood independently from his career as a magazine writer and his participation in the mass and popular culture of his era. Having access only to anthologized versions of his writing and of others from this era that make little, if any, mention of how and where these works were originally published erases essential visual and cultural context that played a significant role in how these works were read and understood, and of the role that they played in popular culture and society. With the advent of digital tools, access to some of these sources has become easier, and I and other scholars are beginning to examine the impact of these popular magazines, not only on American literature and culture, but in shaping American identity as well. In an era where our mass media is reminiscent in many ways of theirs, these lessons will not only help us to better understand America of the past, but give us tools to understand our own moment as well. Thank you.
So you were talking about before with like how the illustrator was paid in premium as well as the author, and they were treated with as much, if not more, reverence. If that was the case, then why were, like, as in a lot of the publishings that you put up, why was their name significantly smaller than the author's?
It depends on the well, it's because it's the author's story, right, that's being illustrated there. So the editors recognized that there were people who, if you look through a lot of these, you start to be able to identify who has drawn something even if you don't see their name, right? Because you become familiar with how a certain person illustrates. So in many ways, their art identifies them before their name does. And the artwork, as you can see, is much bigger, right, than the author's name there. And so I think what the editors were recognizing is that a lot of people are going to just be looking at the visual first before they look at anything textual. And that is going to be the thing that either, or one of the things that makes them decide, yes, I'm going to pick this up and read it, or no, that doesn't really interest me at this point. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you sort of demonstrated to us how Fitzgerald and others' short stories can't really be fully understood when published in anthologies outside of their historical context. What would a modern-day republishing of, say, Fitzgerald's stories look like if it were to acknowledge this context? Like, would it be side-by-side newspaper and the story, or what should something like that look like in your view?
So this is one of the central questions and frustrations of people who do my type of work, because of course it's not realistic to reprint an entire magazine. And even were you to do that, you are erasing important evidence from the magazine as a whole, the network that the magazine creates each week, right? Because the readers would get it each week and they would understand this type of content occurs in this type of magazine and these are my expectations for going into this. And we just can't recreate that. Each one of the issues by the end of the 1920s would be almost 300 pages long. So what do, right? I mean, you have to make choices about how to do that. And some of what we're trying to do is giving some taste of it. So in the edition that I've recently published, it's part of a series on his short fiction, we're including the full layout, including facing pages for at least one story that is in each of those. So that at least you can get some kind of sense of what it looked like, the way that it was laid out. Now that is still not the same, right? One very important reason that it's not is that this is how big the Saturday Evening Post was. And they're never gonna let me publish an edition of anything that is this size. So the artwork in here is the detail that you can see is very different. Digital tools offer some ways to think about this as well. But really what it comes down to is editorial decisions about what are we prioritizing. So for prioritizing Fitzgerald, are we going to, what can we include to help them understand his context that maybe isn't everything but is something, right? That gives us a little bit more. Introductory materials can do that as well. Ways to link some of the digital archives, but that in itself is complicated because, for example, the Saturday Evening Post archive is owned by the Saturday Evening Post, and so you have to pay if you want to go and look at it. So it's not just openly accessible except for the stuff that's in the public domain, and a lot of the stuff that's in the public domain is made from microfilms, which means the images are very hard to see and don't give you a sense of what they actually looked like in the magazine. So essentially, you have stumbled upon the great, the great difficulty here. And one of the things that we are constantly thinking about, like what are the best ways to do this? How can we at least give some taste of this? Because we can't do it all, right? Yeah.
So what you mean to say is we can't recreate the past?
Right.
But
Yes. Of course you can. Yeah.
So you mentioned how well compensated Fitzgerald and presumably other authors and artists in these magazines were. What would you say was the dynamic between the magazine and authors like Fitzgerald? And also, how has that dynamic shifted today? Because a lot of writers, especially big writers, certainly are not compensated that well today.
Oh, yes. When I teach, I have a lot of MFAs who take my grad courses, and they are shocked to hear the number before we consider what it's worth now. So it's very, very different. Depends on the magazine. So the Saturday Evening Post was so powerful that they had what I'm calling a non-contract contract system, in which they essentially said, we're not going to sign a contract with anyone. And what a contract is that you as a magazine say, we're going to pay you X amount, and we're going to have the right of first refusal on the next 6, say, of your stories, and each one we want, we'll give you, say, whatever the amount you've agreed on. So $3,500 for each one of those that we take. And so a lot of the magazines would do that. And that, in fact, is what this was meant to advertise, that he had signed a contract with Hearst International for the next 6 of his stories. Pichère was not a good contract writer. He got, in this case, got waylaid into a play that he wrote called The Vegetable that really flopped and didn't write the stories that he said he was going to, so this is not really his thing. But the Post had so much power that they didn't have to do that, and they essentially, how can I say this, bullied people. They would say, you don't, we're not going to give you a contract. And you can, of course, put your stuff elsewhere, but we don't want our magazine to look like other people's magazines. So if you're publishing in other spaces, don't expect us to keep buying stuff from you. So, you know, you can only do that, though, if you're like the biggest and you have the most power. Otherwise, they have to work with you a little bit more, I think. So yeah, they would do this. Now, with the illustrators was a little bit different. People like Norman Rockwell, who some of you may have heard of, he, there's a Rockwell, that's him. He did his covers almost exclusively for the Post. That digital iconography became very associated. So J.C. Lindecker is another one with the Post. They only would publish in those spaces because it is becomes so associated with that. So it's a little bit different there. But someone like Brown, the illustrator, who was a millionaire before the stock market crashed, and he was putting his art in different places too, and was being paid just as well. In fact, there's a Hemingway story in the mid-1930s, so a little bit past this, where both Hemingway and the artist, who's a guy named Dean Cornwell, published a story in Cosmopolitan, and they were each paid $6,000. It was $12,000 just for the art and the story. So, yeah. Does that answer that? Okay. Yes?
Was there a difference in the accessibility of these magazine publications and like actual print novels? Did that impact like his audience and the lack of faith that he had like, in his career?
So the magazine market, I focused here on the popular magazines. The magazine market was actually a broad spectrum. So on the far end, you would have the little magazines, which is where a lot of the high modernist stuff is published, things like T.S. Eliot. And often those had a readership of 200 or 300 people. So in terms of the money we're talking about, obviously, none of that's there. On the other end, you have the pulp magazines. So that's where you're publishing things like Dashiell Hammett, right? There's detective stories, things like that. All of this is in the middle. And in the middle, you've got the really popular stuff like this, and then you've got stuff that's more like anyone familiar with what the New Yorker's like now? They're called the smart magazines. So he published in that middle range, but he would publish different things for different places. So something that would come out in the smart set, which was a smart magazine in that era, was often more. Sometimes it would be more critical, it would be more, not quite as accessible, and he would be paid $300 for it instead of $3,000. So it was, you know, even within his magazine fiction, we see that range. Even the Smart Set, though, had a circulation of 200,000, so it's still being read by a much greater number, or at least being presumably seen by a much greater number than the novels. And it's less, I think, about, therefore, accessibility. I think something like Gatsby in particular is something that's accessible on many levels. You can read it pretty surface level and get a lot from it, and you can read it really deeply and get a lot from it too. And something like This Side of Paradise was huge with people in the late teens, early 20s. That book really is what put him on the map. It's like the voice of the young generation. So it wasn't particularly inaccessible either. I think it's just more about money. And these big magazines really, it's advertising that's paying for this. Incidentally, that's what Fitzgerald was doing before he started publishing. He tried to be an ad man to make money. It made him very sad, so he stopped and went home and put it, and was able to have that overnight success I talked about. But yeah, sure.
Guys, get up, stretch your legs, grab a bite. We'll resume in a few minutes.
Well done, sir.
know that.
Almost like we've been at the same school for
Years.
a while.
Standing up.
Oh, yeah, no, I didn't know that was still going.
Yeah. No, it's
getting feedback is really frequency. Like go through next time someone saw it, they talk about it. There's a actual training that happens. So when I'm talking, it's really faint, but it's still there. And like if they have a soundboard, but I don't know. I mean, I could do it, but I'm not gonna. But you can also like tell whoever you get bothered by it and change it. And that's some of it is though. I just ruined the rest of the night. glad to hear it. Glad to hear it.
Okay.
back toward your seats. Bring your food and your drink.
Okay,
We'll see.
I realize I'm so busy making sure I introduce everyone else, I didn't introduce myself. But then I just assume that you all know who I am, right? You guys know me. That didn't sound weird at all. Well, if you don't know me, I'm Nicole Camacho. I am the director of the SSRP, and I'm also the English department chair, and I'm also the interim head of upper school, and that's right. Secretary of yep, all the hats. One time I was close you guys. Anyway, I would like to introduce our next speaker. Audrey Kim has a keen interest in both the arts and the sciences, with a special enthusiasm for the medical field. In her free time, Audrey can be found gaming, singing, or creating digital art. Among her many honors earned at O'Neill, she is a member of both the Cum Laude and National Honor Societies, and a National Merit Scholarship finalist. Also an active member in the community, Audrey was a golf coach for First Tee and has enjoyed being a part of the travel team for Model UN and Science Olympiad. She will be attending NC State this fall as a Centennial Scholar and Honor Student, majoring in textile engineering. Her talk is titled De-Genderizing Video Games, the Stereotypes, Perceptions, and Experiences of Girl Gamers.
Good evening, everybody. So tonight I will be talking to you all about my paper, which is titled De-Genderizing Video Games, the Stereotypes, Perceptions, and Experiences of Girl Gamers. So just to open, I do want to define degenderizing. I know that it's a term that we don't necessarily use in our day-to-day conversation. And to put it simply, degenderizing is to eliminate reference to a specific gender, whether it occurs in media, words, conversation, or actions. And to clarify why my paper does not offer direct solutions on degenderizing the industry, it acknowledges a lot of the issues that we need to look at in order to move towards that direction. And so just a brief page about my interests. So I've grown up playing video games a lot with my dad and brother. It's been a way for me to connect with my family. They're in the audience today. And then specifically, being a woman in the video game world, I've directly experienced a lot of the behaviors I will be talking about in my presentation today. And then lastly, I do want to bring more attention to video games as a whole, for both the positives it has to offer and the negatives, as I do believe it to be a medium with the potential to be something similar like film or literature as it functions in today's society. However, we do need to address the negatives it has in order to move towards that direction. And so here's just a brief agenda of the topics I'm going over today. We're going to start by looking at the origin of the video gamer stereotype as it applies to men and women, and then the treatment of women in those spheres. Next, we will look at the representation of female characters within video games regarding their character designs. Next, we are going to look at the impact of advertisement of female participation in the video game industry. And then for women who do choose to pursue their dreams, how do they function at video game workplaces? And then lastly, why does this topic matter? So to open, the stereotypes and treatment of women in gaming. And so first, I do want to look at the stereotypes for video gamers. As it occurs in the in the 1980s and 1990s, generally, the image people associate with video gamers are a young Caucasian male living in their mom's basement, not employed, kind of generally a slob. However, that stereotype has changed in recent years, and it's generally more associated with the masculine identity or the masculine group, not necessarily women still. And so I want to attribute that to 3 different areas. I talk about the technology industry in my paper, So with the growth of the technology industry in the 1980s and 1990s, especially with more video games being developed, female involvement was incredibly limited in that sphere. So there is still that persistent belief in that time period where women belong in only the domestic sphere and not necessarily the workforce. So they would be at home, putting dinner on the table, making sure the house was clean when the men came home, whereas men would be going out, working, making money for the family. And so because more men were working within this technology industry, it kind of created this division where women believed that they were not supposed to interact with technology on many levels. So whether there was a computer in the house, there was something that needed to be fixed, that was something to be left for the men since they were experienced with that. They worked with that on a day-to-day basis, and women did not. And furthermore, just looking into mainstream video games that we see on television and esports, they do tend to lean towards masculine qualities rather than feminine. So when you have video games where you're trying to beat another team, it leans into these qualities of domination, winning against one another with skill, competition, often through the use of violence, use of weapons, strength, etc. And that's definitely a far cry from what we see with femininity, which we often think of as warmth, support from one another, being on the sidelines rather than in the front lines. So in that way, we already find ourselves associating this activity with men. And then lastly, generational stereotype reinforcement, which is simply put just the idea that since we have this stereotype originating from the 1980s and 1990s, parents will tell their kids or give them gifts that are kind of in line with the stereotypes. Boys will receive video games for Christmas or their birthdays, whereas girls will receive dolls, books, etc. And so when you have your own kid, often you'll look to what your parents did and just do the same kind of thing. So in this way, the stereotype kind of stays alive through generations. And so this is kind of how we see the image of a gamer as a guy, but then for women who exist in the video game industry, there are still very much stereotypes applied to them as well. And one of the biggest components of that is, one of the biggest components of that stereotype is in regards to their competence. So in general, women are perceived to be less competent at video games compared to men only on the basis of their gender. So regardless of whatever skill they may display within that video game setting, just because of their gender, they will be seen as inferior to men. And so this is one way that people try to justify a lot of the hostility expressed towards women in the video game setting. I know a couple times for me when I've played a video game, just because they recognize that I am a woman, it'll already be a situation where they don't want to play with me because they believe I will be not as good at the game. And so this is just one of the examples of prejudice towards women, and just one of the examples of bad behavior that are expressed towards this group, which I will go more into depth on the next slide, which kind of looks at the treatment that women physically face in the video game world. So women often face harassment, which can be sexual or otherwise, death threats, mocking insults, and condescension. And to be clear, this doesn't just apply to women. Men also face this kind of behavior. However, it is shown that women suffer from this kind of behavior far more often, and often to a far more severe degree. And a lot of the times, this kind of treatment will come from their gender rather than because they are playing not as well as another person. And so because of these behaviors, this leads to 3 different strategies women employ in order to prevent this behavior from occurring in the first place, which I can't go into detail, but the 3 are opting out, muting gender, and limiting network involvement. And so these are ways that women do avoid these 4 bad forms of treatment. However, it doesn't actually subvert any gender norms of any kind. It only kind of places them on the periphery of the video gaming community and not actually moving towards a more inclusive environment. And so with all of these kind of treatments and hostilities in mind toward women, it does actually manifest in very real, physical, and dangerous consequences for people who try to speak out and move towards that more inclusive community. And one of these examples is Gamergate. And so Gamergate was an internet harassment campaign that occurred from 2014 to 2015, and it was mainly against women in the video gaming community. It initially started with the video game developer Zoe Quinn, and she developed this game called Depression Quest. And what had happened is she got an excellent review from a gaming journalist platform online, very reputable, known as Kotaku. And what had happened is people began accusing her of sleeping with that said journalist in order to receive that good review. So already in the minds of a lot of people who were looking at this game without having even played it, they couldn't believe that a woman could produce a good game. So in this way, it is a reflection of that hostility of the gaming community towards women. And this wasn't only expressed towards Zoe Quinn. This happened to many other prominent women in the gaming community, such as Anita Sarkeesian, she's a feminist gaming activist in the community, and a lot of the times these women would be put into danger because people were sending death threats to them. They were revealing very personal information about them online, so they often had to stay with relatives or book rooms at hotels, and they couldn't live at home safely. And so that kind of transitions me away from talking about how women physically suffer from this hostile environment to how women are actually represented in this medium itself. So there is a gender disparity in terms of how many or what characters you can play in video games, there are often more male protagonists or characters you can play for who are male rather than female. And so I cite from two different examples. So with mainstream multiplayer online video games, there are often wide rosters of characters you can select from. And so my example here, I'm pulling from League of Legends, which is an extremely popular video game that has been around for about 15 years. So it lasting that long is a testament to its popularity. Out of its 166 characters you can play from, only about 64 of these characters are female, which is about 38–39% of that character roster. And that means there is a 20% difference between female and male characters, which is about 34 characters, to put it into perspective. And so while Riot, the developer of League of Legends, has been making leaps to improve this, gap, because they have released more female characters and colored female characters, such as Senna, there is still much work to be done. And in regards to story games or single-player narrative-based video games, where you don't necessarily have 166 characters to play from, you're locked in on one character and following a story with them. There's also a gender disparity. So I talk about E3, which is a video gaming convention that was last aired in 2021. It was unfortunately canceled after that because of its lack of popularity after COVID. However, at the 2020 E3 convention, only 18% of video game protagonists had exclusively female protagonists. And even beyond that, those who were presenting these new video games at this convention, only about 23 of the presenters themselves were also female. And so this is important to recognize because although there is also a percentage of video games where you can create your own characters, there's also that percent of only being able to play a male character. Oftentimes in a lot of media, we want to see ourselves in those characters. And I think a lot of times when we pick up books or read a movie or watch a movie, we watch it based on whether we can relate to this character. And so even though almost 50% of the video gaming audience are actually female, there is just a huge disparity of video game companies actually creating video games for that 50%. It's all leaning towards men or being able to create yourself. It is a huge thing to ask your players to specifically play this one gender, something that may be outside of your sphere. So there is that gender disparity, and then there's also a there is basically less unique character design for a lot of female characters as well. So I want to talk about same-face syndrome, which exists not in just the video gaming community, but in art in general. So this is basically when characters lack unique design and they all kind of begin to look the same. They don't have any defining features. And so what happens to a lot of women portrayed in video games is that they'll be portrayed as very conventionally attractive, right? So they'll have slim bodies, V-shaped necklines, or jawlines, heart-shaped lips, almond eyes, etc. I can go on and on. They all begin to look very similar. And so this four picture I have on the slide right here, They also come from League of Legends. These are 4 different champions. But can you tell the difference between any of them? Not really. They all look practically the same. So this is just one of the examples in that game specifically of female champions having no differentiating features between them. They all look extremely similar. So not only does this occur on the physical level for female character design, but it also occurs for the personality tropes we see. So female characters will often lean into very specific tropes, such as, the sexy character. I'm sure we can all think of Lara Croft from Tomb Raider. She is one of the most prominent female gaming figures. However, she is a sexy character at the very end of the day. And then there's also like that cute trope, that nerdy scientist, or that hyper-feminine princess or tomboy. So you very rarely see a lot of nuance, or a lot of the most famous video gaming characters we can think of who are female tend to be in line with one of these tropes. And so, just besides how women are portrayed in video games and are treated, female participation is also impacted by how these video games are advertised to a lot of its audiences. Whoops, sorry. So I want to talk about the effects of violent marketing on women, because video games tend to use a lot of violence in their trailers and their advertisements, especially just mainstream ones, because as we know with first-person shooters, the concept itself is rather violent. You're trying to eliminate another player, whether it's through the means of a lethal weapon or magical abilities, sorry. And so that is just generally very common with video games, and one of the examples I cite would be Hitman, especially with sexualized violence, because throughout their advertisements, they will often portray a murdered woman in the nude, on their bed in a bathtub, whereas men in that series have never been portrayed in the nude or sexualized as such. And so it's very interesting that women are only affected by this, and it actually impacts the way that women will perceive these video games and how they want to interact with it, because according to a study I found on the impact of violent advertisement for women, men actually responded far more positively to advertisements containing violence or sexualized violence compared to women who responded far less positively. And I have written here that women will turn away from video games when they see themselves or women portrayed in such a disparaging manner. However, I think that applies to much of anyone. Whenever you see a part of yourself, an identity portrayed in media in a negative light, you will be far less likely to engage with that piece of media. And so it goes just beyond violent marketing though, because the products that are released in video games, particularly in the 1990s and 1980s, less so these days, however it still exists, the products that are released are extremely gendered, and the advertisements, again, are gendered. So this is a console, the picture that might be familiar to more of you guys. This was the Game Boy, released in 1989, and it's in the name Game Boy. It's not a Game Girl or just a general game console for everyone. And people may think like, oh, it's just a name. It's not that deep. However, it does say a lot about what video game companies were thinking and how women will kind of look at that. If you're a girl and you're looking at this console and it's like, oh, Game Boy. That's not for me, that's for my brother. So it definitely does have an impact on how these products are perceived and which audience groups they're made for. And furthermore, when there were video games created for women, they would be based on the stereotypes of what developers thought women should or would like. And so this kind of applies to fashion and makeup games that are advertised. We tend to associate that with something women or young girls should play, or cooking games. And so one of the other examples I kind of look at from 1987, Nintendo tried to release a knitting game. It was called the Nintendo Knitting Machine. It sounds really exciting, doesn't it? Super exciting. So they kind of released this in mind for young women. They were like, this is something they would like, right? Doing a domestic chore as an 8-year-old. Which definitely wasn't the case, because women do want to play adventure games and do a lot of the things that men get to play, rather than these makeup, fashion, cooking, knitting games. So yeah, a lot of these products do tend to be gendered and skewed more towards men in that regard. And so now I kind of want to put my focus more towards, again, those women who do decide to pursue their dreams. They have a passion in video games, so they go out into the workforce and join a big company. So what is life like for them at these companies? My conclusion is it's not good. They are not having great work lives at these companies. So I look at 2 company scandals. So I have the logos here for Riot Games and Blizzard Entertainment. These are some of the leading video game companies in our industry today. They are responsible for video games like League of Legends, World of Warcraft, Valorant. Overwatch is maybe more familiar to the younger audience. However, they're billion-dollar companies, and they do not have a very welcoming work environment for women. In fact, in 2018, for around the same time for both of these companies, women who used to work at these companies filed lawsuits against them for sexual harassment and general sexual discrimination in the workplace, because it existed at almost every facet of their lives there. Whether it occurred in promotions, so women who had the credentials, had been doing their job well, been working longer, men who were newer and didn't do their job as well would often be promoted first. And even at the hiring stage, women would be turned away before men, because in the minds of a lot of the hires who, again, were men, if they didn't play the same games as them or weren't a hardcore gamer in terms of like they didn't play just Candy Crush, they would not be a good fit for the company because they just don't play games like we do, even if they had all the correct credentials and were perfect for that position they were looking for. And even in just general workplace or interactions, women would be dismissed for a lot of their ideas. So in the Riot lawsuit, a woman interviewed and cited a case where she had an idea and brought it up at a workplace meeting. However, it was completely dismissed. All the guys laughed at her and they didn't want to look at that idea or take it seriously. However, when she told a male coworker of hers to, present that same idea to them at a meeting, they loved that idea. So it was very clearly prejudiced towards women, and it was just not welcome. And in general, they were also sexually harassed on many levels. Blizzard Entertainment specifically had a lot of on-the-shift drinking parties, and there were situations where men would pass around emails ranking how pretty a woman looked, and it would just kind of go on and on. So they recently settled, and Riot had to pay like $100 million to these women who left their company back in 2022, 2021. So these are all very recent cases. It's very ironic too, because Riot Games was actually rated to be like in the top 10 best places to work in America. They meant not for women. So it's not inclusive for them. And so why is this topic important? It's definitely not something like, oh, we need to find the cure for cancer or something like that, or fighting for, well, this is fighting for civil rights, but it's important because I think that this is a reflection of the societal progress we've made in subverting gender norms. For something like this to occur in an activity meant for everybody, a leisure activity even more specifically, I think it's absolutely very concerning for a lot of the people. And these biases also impede complete digital citizenship for women, so the ability for women to freely use the internet responsibly and to use spaces however they like. They can't do it completely because of these biases they face. And lastly, I think that recognizing these issues is the first step into improving them. So we need to make these issues known in order to go forward. So thank you, and I have a slide for my discussion questions, and also I'm going to open the floor to any other questions or comments you would like to make. Thank you. Tyler.
So I have a question about games that offer both male and female characters, but one gender is specifically like the default. I specifically love playing Minecraft, so that's what I'm talking about, just for context. I never really go out of my way to pick the female character, especially since the male character is default. But if the roles were reversed and say the female character was the default character, do you think males would more often or more probably switch to the alternate gender?
It's definitely, there's a lot of interesting facets actually to games where you can choose your own characters. and which gender you get to play. So just regarding that question, for me, it's definitely like I would go out of my way to choose a female character if it was, you know, like it was a reverse situation, because personally I want to place myself in a character where I can relate to the most. You know, I don't want to be playing Steve, I want to play Alex. So I think on that level, lots of people would switch because they just find that they're more related or closely tied to a specific gender. However, in a lot of other games, people will go out of their way to choose different genders based on a variety of factors. So for people who play competitively and, did the screen turn off?
Yeah, you gotta push the button on the bottom right of the screen.
The one that's flashing.
Class all over.
Okay, we're good.
There's multiple
Okay, where
choices
was
class.
So there's a lot of different facets or that go into the decision of what kind of gender you play. So some people, if you're playing competitively, there's a thing called speed runs, which is trying to complete the game the fastest you can. People will choose a female avatar because it is advantageous in terms of having a smaller model, so you won't get hit by as many abilities. So people will choose different models based on that. However, another interesting thing is that women will also go out of their way to choose a male avatar because they don't want to be outed as a girl in that environment. This happens a lot in World of Warcraft. Men tend to be very hostile to female players in that video game, so they'll choose a male avatar in an attempt to not make themselves known as a girl and receive kind of the treatment I talked about. But then also I've read some interviews where people just say, oh, I like the female aesthetic better than the male aesthetic, so they'll just choose based on that too. So it definitely varies person to person. Ms. Callahan.
So to kind of, I've been hearing recently about the Assassin's Creed. I wanted to just kind of hear your thoughts based from, from your vantage point of having done all this research on the current controversy that's
I actually haven't looked that much into it,
No?
so I'm not sure if
Okay.
I'm too aware of that controversy at the moment. I'm sorry. Yes.
So, sorry. Towards the beginning of your presentation, you were talking about how games are typically like even designed at their like core objective level to be more violent and be geared towards domination as an objective in order to like appease to a male audience. How, like, what would you say would be the process in order to degenderize like objectives like that?
Well, it's interesting because, well, first of all, I only mentioned those games because those are what is seen in mainstream media, because those are what can be streamed to large amounts of people in terms of like competitive gaming. Like we have that rise in esports where there's physical competitions much like sports competitions. So that's definitely what people see the most. However, if we were to move towards degenderizing it, truly, I don't think that we can degenderize that topic in general. It's just shifting the culture of how we perceive women in the video gaming industry and world, that first and foremost, they shouldn't be seen as inferior just on the basis of their gender. So it's not necessarily the fault of the video game itself, I would say, because although they do tend to lean more towards masculine coded qualities, it's not necessarily the game that's at fault. It's just that's the audience it attracts. So it's the people that first and foremost need to change, which is an overtime sort of thing, I think, because we can't just tell people to change. It doesn't happen like that. Okay, Caroline? Okay, I don't know. I think, Max, you were raising your hand too before, right?
Yeah.
Okay, Max.
Sure.
Sorry.
You referenced an interesting concept, which is digital citizenship, particularly of women relative to the sexism that's seen in the gaming industry. With companies like Apple or Meta trying to bring the idea of VR digital citizenship from a gaming context to like a metaverse digital reality thing, do you foresee, or what sort of issues do you foresee with the collision of a gaming community with a maybe less gaming but just very digitally active community like people who use the Apple VR headset when those two things began colliding with regards to degenderizing, especially like as actual literal workplaces move to being entirely online or in like a metaverse. Is that a connection that you see with regards to the difference in experience by different genders?
I think that's an interesting question. That's definitely something difficult, I think we'll need to approach. However, I do think that there won't necessarily be new social issues with the two being, I guess, more integrated with each other, because we already see that there are general online communities that aren't necessarily associated with gaming that do also hold kind of sexist views, I feel. So I guess I cite a lot of time on general communities like Reddit, Discord. There are just general sexist behaviors towards women regardless of whether it's a video game community. So in that sense, I don't feel that a gaming community merging with like metaverse and the Apple idea of like a digital citizenship will pose completely new issues, but just that those are things that we're still going to have to solve, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks, Audrey. If you didn't get to ask your question to Audrey, hold on to it. We'll have the Q&A after Caroline's talk. Caroline Acker is the president and co-founder of the Film Analysis Club and a member of Model United Nations. She also belongs to the National Honor Society and has served on the selection committee for O'Neill's literary publication, The Blackbird's Eye. During her summer, she interns at a historical archive in New York. Outside of her academic pursuits, Caroline is an avid guitar player, visual artist, and creative writer. In the fall, she'll be attending Oberlin College under the merit-based John F. Oberlin Scholarship. And she plans to major somewhere in the discipline of English. Her talk is titled The Rhetorics of Retelling, How Ancient Greece Was Transformed into a Tool of Western Hegemony.
Hi. So, my research for the past 2 years in SSRP has centered on the rhetorics of retelling. Essentially, the layers of retelling of ancient Greek civilization, culture, mythology, etc., that we filtered through to reach us in the modern day, especially as these retellings are influenced by political and rhetorical and ideological factors, specifically as they relate to upholding Western hegemony. So ancient Greece is, and I truly cannot overstate this, literally everywhere in our society. Even the name of this event itself, symposium, comes from the ancient Greek symposium, which was a very similar event centered on intellectual discussion. However, the ancient Greek symposium involved a good deal more alcohol and a good deal less formality than the one we have going on here. Just in case there was any issues of how similar they were. So everything from our etymology to how much of our modern English language is stemmed from the ancient Greek language and our writing systems, to naming systems in our academia, things like astronomy, the names of constellations, stars, planets, to things like architecture. If any of you have been to Washington, D.C., or just know what the U.S. Capitol building looks like, it's very, very heavily inspired by ancient Greek architecture. And this ubiquity of ancient Greece in our society is symptomatic of a very implicit idea we tend to have in the West about ancient Greece, which is this idea of sharing some sort of cultural or intellectual heritage with ancient Greece. I'm sure you've all heard the phrase, ancient Greece is the foundation of Western civilization. It's everywhere in our history classes. But this statement is one that is very deeply entrenched in political discourse. So this is a map of ancient Greek settlement in the Archaic period, so before ancient Greece very deeply expanded continentally with people like Alexander the Great. But even at this early stage of settlement,
Ancient Greece was incredibly intercultural. The Mediterranean is an intersection point of Europe, Asia, and Africa. It was by no means homogeneous or purely European or purely white as we would think of it today. Further, this idea that ancient Greece as the foundation of Western civilization, this idea of claiming essentially an exclusive cultural claim to ancient Greece, when places like Western Asia or North Africa would have just as much of that sort of claim to that heritage or to that proximity. So a lot of the sort of roots of these ideas and how we view ancient Greece in the West today relate to the idea of Western cultural hegemony. Totally fine if you haven't heard that word. It's probably a concept that you'll pick up on even if you haven't heard the particular vocabulary. So hegemony is essentially the dominance of one group over another. So when we talk about cultural hegemony, it's generally more implicit, more societal, as opposed to very explicit forms of hegemony, which relate to things like militarism or imperialism. However, cultural hegemony often has a very explicit history of those more military and more violent histories. In the case of the West, we talk about its cultural hegemony when we think of the ways we conceptualize history, the narratives that we apply to history and civilization and the development and the enlightenment of civilizations. And when we talk about the cultural hegemony of the West, it is heavily influenced by the legacy of Western imperialism. So I'm looking at these ideas of ancient Greek retellings through three major time periods. In the Middle Ages, and how Greek myth was domesticated into Christian society, neoclassicism, which was in the early modern period, and the role of art history in conceptualizing ancient Greece, and then finally in modern Greece, and essentially the consequences of these layers of retelling on the modern Greek state. So to begin with the Middle Ages, we're starting with a little bit of a trivia game. So, which of these ideas about ancient Greece was believed by medieval scholars? One, that ancient Greek mythology was derivative of Christian history, essentially that it was stolen from Christian history, that ancient Greek oracles predicted the birth of Jesus Christ, or that Greek religion truly worshipped the Christian God. I'll give you a little bit of time to think about it. Okay. Who thinks it's the first one? All right, who thinks it's the second one? And who thinks it's the third one? A lot of people didn't vote. It was a trick question.
So you just got the presentation.
Yeah, they're cheating. Yeah, so these were all ideas that were very deeply accepted by medieval scholarship, specifically, obviously, Christian scholarship in the medieval period. And as you might have been able to see, there's a pretty explicit commonality in all of these ideas. The idea of creating a link between ancient Greece and Christian society. So this urge to sort of create this proximity between Christian society and Greek society touches on an urge, a political urge, that underlines a lot of classical reception in Europe and elsewhere. The idea of evoking the prestige of ancient Greek civilization. This is by no means a phenomenon exclusive to ancient Greece. It's applicable to any large, prominent, militaristically or culturally influential political body. But as ancient Greece fell under those constraints, it's very applicable to the interactions with ancient Greece. The primary tool used to create these links between Christian mythologies and Greek mythologies in the medieval period is a theory called euhemerism. Essentially, it's the theory that the Greek gods were deified historical figures. That the pantheon was not fully based off of the imagination of the society, but that they were real historical figures that were basically ascended to godhood in the cultural consciousness due to their often political or military influence. And medieval Christian scholars embraced this methodology of examining Greek myth because, to quote historian Carl Brenner, it explained the gods' existence in a way that did not admit divinity. Essentially, it was a safe method of being able to interact with Greek myth without the religious contradiction of this very, very heavily and homogeneously Christian medieval society without having to deal with the contradiction of pagan belief systems in their study of it. And by the end of the 19th century, Euhemerism had essentially been entirely transformed in Europe to mean these attempts of trying to link Christian and Greek society. So looking at examples of Euhemerism in action in the medieval period, Sir Walter Raleigh, same Walter Raleigh that created the capital, or it's named after the capital of North Carolina, his book History of the World, which was, again, history book, world history book, he employed Euhemeristic scholarship in his analysis of the parallels between Adam and Eve and Kronos and Rhea. Adam and Eve are the original humans in the Christian Bible. Kronos and Rhea are titans in Greek mythology. You may have heard of Kronos as the guy who tried to eat all of his children, but outside of that mythological story, Kronos and Rhea are associated with harvest, agriculture, the symbol of the sickle. They're both primordial forces. They're originators of these very important bloodlines, very similar to Adam and Eve as originators of these bloodlines associated with agriculture and the garden. And these connections between Adam and Eve and Kronos and Rhea were not used as evidence of some sort of abstracted spiritual compatibility between the two, but instead used as very explicit historical evidence that Greek mythology was essentially plagiarized from Christian mythologies. This was this narrative that it was a perversion of history stolen from Moses, to quote historian Nicholas Rebecus. And the Italian Renaissance after the medieval period can be explored as a reflection of the social successes of Euhemerism during the medieval period. So this is an art piece by Raphael called the Parnassus. It is a fresco, and it portrays the Greek god Apollo at the center, surrounded by figures both from Greek mythology and of like the contemporary Italian Renaissance landscape. And it's called the Parnassus as it is set on Mount Parnassus, which is a religious site which was a religious site in ancient Greece. And it was made during the Renaissance by Christian Italian Renaissance artists, but it was featuring this very explicitly pagan iconography. And the Parnassus is actually a fresco in the Vatican. It was painted onto the walls of the Vatican. It's like 2 doors down from the Pope. And it's like this idea that like these very explicitly religious pagan figures could coexist in this Catholic space, which was certainly not a dynamic of religious acceptance that was mimicked in other places of Catholic doctrine at the time. So this idea that this was essentially an exception, or that this was sort of a phenomenon that was separated enough from its religious context so as to exist entirely separate from it. So moving on to our next time period, neoclassicism, and the role of our notions of art history influencing our view on ancient Greece. Another trivia game. I promise this one isn't actually a trick question this time. There is a right answer on this one. So only one of these sculptures is an example of ancient Greek art. All 3 of the rest of them are from different civilizations. I would like you to guess which one is the Greek. Some of you know it. You're not allowed to cheat. I'm seeing whispering. So we'll give you some time to think, because it's a tough one. Maybe, depending on what you think. How much you know about art history. Okay, who thinks it's the first one? Okay, who thinks it's the second one? Who thinks it's the third one? And who thinks it's the fourth one? So the first sculpture is from Carthage, which is a North African civilization. The second one, as you may have guessed, is from Egypt. The third one is French. And the fourth one is Greek. In the crowd, how many of you knew that ancient Greek sculptures were painted? Awesome, okay, awesome, that's a lot of people. Well, okay, yeah, okay. 2 years in the class together. So these are examples of polychromy. Polychromy is the act of applying multiple colors to, usually in reference to the painting of statues. And these are Tanagra sculptures from ancient Greece. And they're some of the only surviving examples we have of like fully preserved original Greek polychromy. Because as you can imagine, the millennia separating us from ancient Greece means that most of that color has fully decomposed. But these are some of the few very well preserved examples we have. So despite this knowledge of polychromy, we've known about this since the 1800s in reference to Greek art. Why is our vision of Greek art so predominantly colorless? Why do we have this sort of vision of like the pure white marble statue? Why is this our vision of Greek art, and why does it matter? What does it say about our notions of it and how it reflects in other areas of our society? So these statues are all examples of neoclassical sculpture, which was a dominant cultural and political, artistic and cultural movement especially in Western Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries. It was a movement very heavily inspired by the aesthetics of antiquity, and integrated a lot of art history into its existence. So a lot of the birth of neoclassicism is related to the work and life of Johann Joachim Winckelmann, who was a German art historian, and his idealized vision of antiquity in his writings contributed very heavily to this general idealization that sort of defined the neoclassical vision. He described the colorlessness of Greek statue as an intentional artistic choice. He essentially believed that it was an intentional choice to showcase the form of the body, and it reflected rationality, restraint, logic. These notions that were very consciously were not applied to the civilizations surrounding ancient Greece. This idea that the colorlessness of Greek statue was what set them apart from their other neighbors in the Mediterranean, that they painted their sculptures, but ancient Greece was different. They did not do that. He described a noble simplicity and quiet grandeur as the foundational principles of ancient Greek art. And these sort of cultural subtexts of cultural superiority in Winckelmann's work ended up crystallizing as racial ideologies developed in Europe into very explicit racial meanings applied to the white marble statue. This was present all throughout Europe, but an obviously very concrete example of this was in the Nazi utilization of the ancient Greek sculpture. The body of the sculpture was looked to as inspiration to conceptualize the ideal life and the ideal body. And ancient Greek, the white of ancient Greek sculptures was a very prominent figure in Nazi propaganda. And these associations persist today. White nationalist groups, such as the Identity Europa, still apply these icons of the colorless white marble statue in a lot of their iconography. So within these contexts, archaeologists have recently moved towards recreation of the original polychromy of Greek sculpture. An example up here is the Gods in Color exhibit, which was a touring museum exhibit that was many museums all throughout the world. And there were also similar polychromatic reconstructions that appeared at the Met for a period. So this is an example of a polychromatic reconstruction of a figure of an archer found on a Greek temple. And the polychromatic reconstruction of it is jarring. It's very gaudy. It's got these bright, cramped patterns. It looks like it's wearing nylon tights. Like it looks like it's, it doesn't look like our idea of what antiquity looked like. But these pigments were picked up from pigments, there was not much surviving pigment on this archer itself, but the pigments were drawn from the sculptures found in the exhibition surrounding it. So these pigments, these vivid pigments, were derived from surrounding sculptures. And this pattern on the legs and arms was found through a very scientific technique that I couldn't explain to you if I tried. It's called UV raking, but it's essentially this, computerized light like electromagnetic analysis that identified these patterns on the surface of the skin. There's obviously always a level of uncertainty associated with these polychromatic retellings. Just the sheer amount of time that's passed between antiquity and now means that like an entirely certain reconstruction of what these sculptures look like is impossible. But we are able to look to other accounts of poetry or other art forms or other written accounts, in addition to the physical evidence we do have of these sculptures, to recreate what we think they originally looked like. And in a slightly different vein, the polychromy of Greek sculpture, as it relates to these racialized subtexts, especially impacted the idea of ancient Greek bronzes. So bronzes were they were also very prominently used as a sculptural material in addition to the marble. It never gained the same sort of iconographic status that marble did. But because of the colorlessness previously associated with antiquity and with the Greek statue and with the Greek body, bronze had sort of been placed in a similar category of the material not having that much weight to the artistry of the sculpture. But these residues found on these two sculptures, called the Briace warrior bronzes, there was evidence found of differing patinas found on the skins of the bronzes. Essentially, this idea that these differing chemicals and differing ratios of these chemicals were applied to the bronzes to achieve differing skin tones. The idea that the patina of the bronze was an intentional polychromatic act, and that it was intentioned to portray darker skin tones through the use of the bronze in its patinas. And this tracks with what we know historically about ancient Greek beauty standards. Darker skin on men was considered the embodiment of masculinity, and heroes from places like the Iliad and the Odyssey and Homeric writings were often described as dark-skinned. So these sorts of polychromatic reconstructions get to an idea that is very core to a lot of my research, which is the idea that when a retelling is integrated deeply enough into a society, the absence of retelling can become a retelling in and of itself. Essentially, the idea that we become so used to this colorless vision of ancient Greek art that when we see, even if it might not be entirely accurate, when we see a vision of it that is far more accurate than the colorless vision, it feels like a retelling. It feels incorrect. Essentially, that's that sort of dynamic at play. And then our final time period, looking into the modern day, in the recent I say modern day, but in some of the sites I talk about like up to the 1800s. But essentially modern Greece and the creation of the modern Greek state and the consequences of these layers of retellings in Europe. So a dynamic that defines this sort of time period is an idea coined by the classical historian Louis Ruprecht, the agony of inclusion. Essentially, the idea that through these layers and layers of retelling in Europe in the millennia since ancient Greece, that ancient Greece has been elevated to such an unreachable, unattainable height of utopic society, of artistic achievement, of cultural elevation, that it is impossible for modern Greece to live up to these expectations because the original vision never truly existed in the way that they thought it did. And this sort of dynamic came through pretty explicitly in the history of the creation of the modern Greek state. So after Greece gained independence from the Ottoman Empire in the 1800s, as often happens when a state gains independence from after a long period of its history being under occupation, there was a lot of political discourse and a lot of unrest attempting to define what their new independent society would look like. Who would be in power? How would power be exerted? These very ubiquitous political questions of their new independent society. Major European powers saw this unrest going on and decided to go about a strategy that is unfortunately very common in European history, which is to attempt to solve these problems without talking to the people that the problems occurred. So these major European powers, such as Britain and Germany, held a conference in London that was fully absent of any Greek presence, and they decided essentially the future of their leadership and their political future without talking to any of them. So a German prince, Otto Friedrich Ludwig, ended up being the first leader of the modern Greek state, as opposed to someone from Greece. And in a lot of the obviously very politically contentious future of Otto Friedrich Ludwig's leadership, there were many architectural projects that accompanied this general, essentially, rebuilding of an independent Greece. And a lot of these architectural projects attempted to rebuild Greece, not necessarily just in a context of independence from an empire, but specifically in reference to the ideas, the broad European ideas of what ancient Greece, or of what Greece should look like. The idea of recreating it in the image of this civilization that had been millennia ago. Not that many millennia, but millennia is a long time. Greek author George Zarkadakis describes these architectural projects as creating essentially a Disneyland of Greece, especially of Athens in particular. This idea of creating a romantic theme park that complied with what these German architects believed ancient Greece believed what Greece should be. And with this history and with the relationships between Europe at large and Greece, narratives of de-evolution became very common, very ubiquitous. And it's a general argument of cultural degeneration, of this idea that the modern Greeks are not as good as the ancient Greeks, that the ancient Greeks had all of these like immense and incredible philosophical and intellectual and democratic and political and architectural and like all of these like amazing ideals that were absent, or at least at the very least degraded in their society in modern Greece. And these ideas of cultural degeneration quickly tailspinned into narratives of racial degeneration. Especially this idea of ancient Greece and its proximity in the Mediterranean, especially to the Middle East, and this idea of making the modern Greeks an amphibian race, of this idea of being degraded from the original racial purity that was visualized in Europe generally. And this, again, this concept of influence from the Middle East or of North Africa as a corrupting force in modern Greece ignores a very potent idea that in ancient Greece, which is that ancient Greece was multicultural, that ancient Greece was influenced by the Middle East and North Africa, and that this ancient Greek civilization was by no means homogeneous. So that it ignores that historical reality of antiquity. So some key takeaways of my research and of this presentation essentially relate to the ideas of Eurocentrism in classical academia and in our ideas of classics at large. So the idea of building a future of classics that moves away from this Eurocentrism, and in addition, gaining awareness of the political subjectivity behind a lot of these ideas that we take for granted, and these historical narratives that we just accept as truth, and especially when we're dealing with something as cloaked in uncertainty as ancient civilization, and these ideas of being able to grasp the subjectivity of these sorts of ideas. And then I have some discussion questions, or any other unrelated questions. My discussion questions, what relationship exists between academia and the development of specific narratives of history? Or what are other examples of modern political contexts that ancient Greece exists within? Or again, a secret third thing. Any other sort of question?
I'll jump on the second question, because when I think about cultural hegemony in that concept, it feels very similar to the culture wars that we talk about today in America. And I very frequently, and probably to the chagrin of my family, try and talk too often about, I think that the classics actually are kind of a breeding ground for the culture wars today? Because it seems on one side that you see, like, I at least see the rise of the popularity of like classical education in America. Oftentimes, not all the times, these schools are very conservative, and you see sort of, I've seen this mentality of like, we need to bring back Odyssean manhood into America and these sorts of, and trying to, you know, revitalize, like the sculptures and things like that. And then on the other side, you see, like in any bookstore, all of these sort of like modern retellings that seem to come from sort of leftist lenses, oftentimes, you know, trying to add LGBTQ representation to Greek myths and things like that. And it feels like the left and the right are sort of battling for like ownership of many of these tales to sort of push the culture wars. And I'm curious how you see sort of these things, like in the modern day, especially as they come to retellings and our political landscape in 2024.
Yeah. So modern retellings are definitely, like, especially when you think of like YA fiction, they're definitely probably the most prominent access a lot of people my age tend to experience with the idea of a mythological retelling. And especially this idea that these retellings that attempt to center these more marginalized voices of history in general, not only of ancient Greece, in these retellings, this idea that history has always been, has never been this homogenous group. So I definitely think that especially the contrast between the field of classics, which has historically been quite conservative, especially as it is intertwined with these legacies of European identity and hegemony, as I talked about. So this field that is often very exclusionary, especially in explicit like academic or university circles. A lot of people often are sort of excluded implicitly or explicitly from these environments because it is seen as this sort of homogenous field that is centered towards a very specific demographic of a white man. And I do think that a lot of these retellings that attempt to center these marginalized voices and these more, as you mentioned, like leftist perspectives, I do think generally, I don't want to get too much into specific, because I think a lot of these retellings come from a good place in this idea of like recentering history, and often a sort of diatribe against these retellings and that they're historically inaccurate because they center like queer voices or because they center non-white people, when those things were absolutely part of ancient Greek civilization. There often are inaccuracies in those retellings, essentially as they relate to mostly things like moral anachronism and the idea of integrating a vastly different society into our own and every part of our cultural values that are vastly different. So I do think sometimes these modern retellings can come with a bit of a lack of historical literacy, and not for the reasons a lot of people like to claim it is, but because I think often it does sort of gloss over a lot of the often very brutal realities of antiquity. But I think it's I don't think there's, I definitely wouldn't say that these modern retellings are a net negative, I don't think. Yeah.
So you talked about euphemerism. I was wondering if you could give like a more in-depth example of it and like why they would be depicted as like why a historical figure would be depicted as a Greek god or myth.
Yeah. So this idea of like the deified living is a general religious concept that does exist. Even just in cases of Christianity, the idea that Jesus Christ as a real living historical person being like a deified figure, or the idea of someone like the Buddha, again a real person that sort of ascended to this more deified level, that's generally a concept that exists across many religions. And I think this application of those ideas to specifically the ancient Greek pantheon, again it was often rooted partially in an idea to attempt to explain how they got these very specific figures and these specific mythologies out of these figures that are often embodiments of some sort of biological or natural force. So I think, I do think that, so are you mostly asking essentially like an example of euphemerism, or?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think there were many accounts of specifically Zeus being a very prominent Athenian leader, of this idea that these prominent city-states, or that these prominent politicians rose to their place in the pantheon according to that. So this idea of Olympians as these major gods, and then other gods outside of this major pantheon being lesser, but still having some sort of place within that narrative. The issue with most of these ideas of euhemeristic scholarship is that although there were some legitimate attempts at euhemeristic scholarship, especially during ancient Greece, most of it branched very deeply away from these narratives with the medieval period, as I talked about, how it doesn't necessarily relate as much to this idea of trying to legitimately explain these pantheons as much as it is about more political or religious ends, essentially.
Just to follow up on this, to clarify for myself, the origination of the Greek gods, were they actually considered gods at the origin, or were they actually people that were deified?
Yeah, so unfortunately, because this is such like an infinitely old religion, it's really hard for us to be able to know with any complete certainty. The Greek gods generally tended to not be written about in a way that was very grounded in the political, cultural realities of ancient Greece, which means a lot of scholars have turned away from euhemerism because they exist in such a separate sphere. Because Greek mythology features both gods and mortal, essentially ordinary characters. So there isn't obviously an exact consensus, but generally euhemerism is by no means the dominant view of the origins of Greek myth. So there's not, in cases like, for instance, like Buddhism, where it's a very concrete idea that this was a real human person that was deified, but this idea that it's looking for attempted explanations for this question that we really don't have any very concrete answer to. Yeah.
So, what do you think was the big central cause of Greeks, ancient Greek society being so glorified and widespread in Western society today? Was it more Alexander the Great, his conquest of trying to Greekify literally everything that he touched, or was it more the Roman Empire's adoption of Greek or Greek society?
Yeah. So, sorry. That's a spoiler for tomorrow. Yeah. So, I think I'm briefly going to talk about. I have a lot of things to say about Alexander the Great. It's not really related to your question, but I do want to talk about Alexander the Great. But yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with that thing I mentioned briefly of this idea of political prestige, especially with the Roman Empire. This idea that the Roman Empire, when it colonized Greece, already was enacting this sort of narrative of the cultural prestige of ancient Greece. So with its colonization, with its adoption of many aspects of Greek myth and society and culture, as many know about historical mythologies, the Roman pantheon is almost identical to the Greek pantheon, just with the names being different. There are some distinctions, but they're very, very, very similar. So this idea of Rome adopting so many of these features of ancient Greece, already an attempt to embody this sort of political prestige, and with the expansion of the Roman Empire and its massive, massive military and geographical expansion and successes, I think a lot of that prestige was sort of transferred throughout Europe by the Roman Empire with its sort of levels of proximity to ancient Greece. So because we feel like ancient Greece and ancient Rome are so linked in the imagination, even though they were distinct societies, but they did share enough similarities that those sorts of layers were sort of moved on from society to society. Brief thing about Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great actually didn't have that large an influence in Western hegemony. Most of Alexander the Great's empire moved east. Most of it was around Persia, the Arabian Peninsula, even tried to get into India, didn't really work out, but it was very, very far east. And he did, not very far, but he expanded generally more continentally from the Mediterranean towards that direction. He did expand especially farther north into the Balkans, but he really didn't do that much as extensive conquest in towards the west as he did in the east, mainly because in this time period, generally more societies that were more politically prominent and often had more wealth were more east. The rise of European military and political dominance didn't sharply rise until naval technology, until very like increased and better naval technologies. So I think a lot of it has to do with essentially these ideas of most of it has to do with the Roman Empire, I think, as opposed to Alexander the Great.
Thank you.
Okay. Yes.
So when did it become generally known historically? It's more of an art history question. The idea that these Greek statues were fully painted. Because you brought up the Winckelmann slide, which was a great slide about incorporating it into European history in that age. So when did it become known that the statues were painted?
Yeah.
As a general concept.
Yeah, so the very first very concrete archaeological example of Greek polychromy came in the 1800s with the uncovering of a head on an Aegean island. It was only a head. It did not. There was a temple collapse, and with that collapse, there was a lot of damage to the structures. But because it was buried under these layers and very isolated from the environmental stressors around it, that meant a lot of the polychromy on the sculpture survived. So this was a very concrete example we have from the 1800s that this was a feature of Greek art. And it took more scholarship after that, of course, to see if this was a fully, like a majority occurrence. But even then, we have ancient Greek sources in literature and in first-hand accounts and in poetic literature that does refer to the sculptors painting their works. So these contemporary sources did mention that this was a feature, that this was part of their society, and that this was part of their process. So we have these sources that attest to it from the time period it was done in, but from the 1800s, from this more concrete example, and then further archaeological evidence, and especially with its relevance and how prominently it did feature in literature, this idea that the majority, if not the majority, at least a very good number of these statues were polychromatic.
Well, I love your Hitler slide because he didn't have the polychromatic picture of the human body or anything in the museum.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
I want to, well, we just did give them a round of applause, but I do want to acknowledge our speakers, all of our speakers, doing such a great job tonight. I know the sun is bothering some of you folks, and I'm sorry about that. We should have set it up differently, you know, live and learn. Next year, tomorrow night. I would invite you to stay so that you can get up out of the sun, if you like, and continue asking our speakers some questions. We're talking with them about their topics and their research. They love talking about it, and you need to know that they've spent 2 years doing a lot of this research and writing and doing minute presentations. And it was really difficult for them to select what information to include on the short, relatively short presentation that you saw tonight. So there's a lot more, and they would love to talk to you about it. So please have some more to eat and stay and talk to our speakers, and I hope we'll see you tomorrow night. Thank you for coming.